Project Acoustic Kitty, the CIA's $20 million secret that ended under a taxi, Washington, D.C., 1966. There is a van parked on Wisconsin Avenue, nothing remarkable about it. An unmarked panel van, the kind that disappears into city traffic without leaving a trace. Inside, men sit in the dark with headphones on and dials in front of them. They are officers of the Central Intelligence Agency, the most powerful intelligence apparatus in the history of the world. And they are waiting for a signal. Not from a satellite. Not from a human asset buried deep inside the Kremlin. Not from a wiretap or a double agent or a stolen document. They are waiting for a cat. A gray and white house cat. A microphone sewn into her ear canal. A radio transmitter implanted at the base of her skull. A battery pack sitting in her chest cavity. A thin wire antenna woven through her fur from the nape of her neck all the way down to the tip of her tail. 5 years of classified research behind her. Engineers who spent careers building this. Surgeons who put her under the knife more than once. Somewhere between $15 and $20 million in American taxpayer money, in 1960s dollars, all of it resting on what this one animal does next. The van door opens. The cat steps out onto Wisconsin Avenue. She walks into the road, and a taxi hits her. Not after a moment of triumph. Not after she wandered over to the Soviet diplomat and recorded something that justified years of work. The moment the CIA released their most expensive asset onto the street, a cab driver who had no idea he was changing history ran her over. The officers sat in that van with their headphones and their dials and their years of classified effort, and they watched their program die in the gutter in seconds. That at least is one version of the story. There is a second version. A man who was also inside the CIA says the cat survived, had all the equipment surgically removed, and lived out the rest of her life in peace. 2 versions. One dead cat, or one very relieved cat, and we will come back to why that dispute matters, and what it reveals about the institution that created her, before this is over. But first, to understand why anyone on Earth thought it was a reasonable idea to put a microphone inside a house cat and send her after Soviet diplomats, you have to understand what the world felt like in the early 1960s. Because this story is not really about a cat. It is about what existential fear does to powerful institutions when no one is holding them accountable. Cast your mind back. Not to the Cold War as a historical concept, not to the clean timelines and reassuring retrospective analysis of textbooks. Imagine waking up every morning genuinely uncertain whether civilization will survive the decade. Imagine that is not anxiety or paranoia. Imagine that is just the news. On October 27, 1962, the most dangerous single day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine designated B-59 sat in the Atlantic Ocean, unable to reach Moscow, unable to receive orders, surrounded by American destroyers dropping grenades into the water around it to force it to surface. The submarine had no way of knowing whether the grenades were signals or attacks. The temperature inside the hull had climbed past 100 degrees. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, believed war had already started. He prepared his nuclear torpedo for launch. He was not operating on a whim. He was operating on the protocol his government had given him. If under attack and unable to reach command, you are authorized to fire. The political officer aboard agreed with him. 2 out of 3 senior officers were ready to fire a nuclear weapon from a submarine in the Atlantic Ocean. The 3rd officer was a man named Vasily Arkhipov. He was not the captain. He was the flotilla chief of staff, aboard B-59 by circumstance rather than assignment. And on that specific submarine, because of that specific circumstance, Soviet protocol required unanimity. All 3 senior officers had to agree before the special weapon could be released. Arkhipov said no. He argued with Savitsky for long enough that the captain stood down. B-59 surfaced. The Americans, who had no idea what had almost happened below them, escorted the submarine to international waters and let it go. Arkhipov died in 1998. He never heard himself called a hero. He never knew that in 2002, at a conference in Havana marking the 40th anniversary of the crisis, the director of the National Security Archive would say publicly that Vasily Arkhipov was the man who saved the world. His widow, who attended that conference, confirmed that her husband had spoken of the incident only rarely and had never considered what he did remarkable. The margin between the world we know and the world that could have been was one man, in a metal tube beneath the Atlantic Ocean, in a room that was over 100 degrees, who decided to say no. That is the world the CIA was operating in. Not an abstract national security concern, a daily, genuine, visceral terror that the wrong missed intelligence, the wrong surprise, meant nuclear fire from coast to coast. So when the crisis passed and the ships turned back and the warheads were dismantled, the CIA did not breathe and go home. They went back to work with a specific question burning behind everything. How do we know in advance what the Soviets are actually planning? Because the problem with nuclear war, the problem that separates it from every other kind of conflict in history, is that you cannot survive a surprise attack. By the time the missiles are in the air, the decision is already made. You need warning, minutes of it, which means intelligence, which means knowing what Soviet officials are saying to each other in private before they act on it. And getting inside those conversations was, it turned out, extraordinarily difficult. Most people picture Cold War espionage as human drama. Double agents, defectors, dead drops in the park. That world existed. But the deeper, grinding, daily battle of the Cold War was fought with something far less cinematic: listening devices. Both sides were obsessed with bugging each other. If you could hear what the enemy was saying in an unguarded moment, in a room they believed was secure, you could anticipate their moves before they made them. You could win without firing a shot. The CIA had brilliant engineers inside the Directorate of Science and Technology, people who spent their careers inventing new ways to listen. They planted bugs in walls, in furniture, in objects the Soviets thought were harmless. They were creative and relentless. But the KGB was equally disciplined. Soviet intelligence swept their own facilities constantly. Technical teams ran counter-surveillance protocols before sensitive conversations. Every bug the Americans planted eventually got found. The cycle was brutal. Plant a bug, get discovered, build a better bug, build a better sweep. Around and around, year after year, a silent arms race that consumed decades and produced only temporary advantages. And then, in 1952, the Americans discovered something that made the whole problem feel almost insulting. Soviet intelligence had been listening to the private study of the U.S. ambassador in Moscow for 7 years. 7 years. It started in August 1945 at the tail end of World War II, when the United States and Soviet Union were still nominally allies. A group of Soviet schoolchildren from the Young Pioneer Organization, a kind of Soviet Boy Scouts, arrived at Spaso House, the American ambassador's residence in Moscow, and presented Ambassador Averell Harriman with a hand-carved wooden replica of the Great Seal of the United States, a gesture of friendship between wartime allies. Harriman hung it in the study of his residence. It stayed there for years, passed from one ambassador to the next, hanging on the wall of one of the most sensitive diplomatic spaces in the American Foreign Service. Nobody swept it. Why would they? It was a gift from children. It was wood and lacquer and paint. Inside it was one of the most sophisticated listening devices ever built. The device had been designed by a Soviet scientist named Léon Theremin, the same man who invented the theremin musical instrument, that strange, eerie instrument played without being touched that you hear in old science fiction films. As a surveillance device, theremin had done something almost beautiful in its simplicity. The bug contained no battery, no active power source, no circuitry that would emit any signal a sweep team could detect. It was completely invisible and completely dormant until a Soviet van parked near the building aimed a specific radio frequency at it. At that moment it came alive, the sound of nearby voices modulating its signal, and it transmitted everything it heard back to the van outside, undetectable by every sweep technology the Americans had. No power to measure, no signal to intercept until the Soviets chose to activate it. From 1945 to 1952, through the beginning of the Cold War, through critical diplomatic negotiations, through the early years of the nuclear age, Soviet intelligence sat outside and listened. Every conversation, every plan, everything the American ambassador said when he believed no one outside his own walls could hear him. The CIA called the device the Thing. They found out about it partly by accident when British radio operators near the embassy stumbled onto American voices on an open Soviet frequency. 7 years, in the ambassador's own study. When the full scope of that penetration became clear inside American intelligence, the response was not just embarrassment. It was professional shame mixed with a determination not to be outthought again. The Soviets had built something the CIA's best engineers hadn't imagined. Something invisible and passive. Something that had sat in plain sight on a diplomat's wall for the better part of a decade. The Americans wanted to answer it, not just match it, exceed it. They wanted something that didn't need to be placed at all. Something that could position itself near a sensitive conversation on its own. Something that could go where bugs couldn't go and where agents couldn't follow. Something so ordinary, so completely expected in any urban environment, that no Soviet counter-surveillance team in the world would think to account for it. And the answer, someone at the CIA decided in 1961, was a cat. The exact meeting where this was approved is not in any declassified document. History doesn't preserve the room, or the faces, or the first person who said it out loud. But we know the proposal reached the senior levels of the Directorate of Science and Technology. We know it was evaluated, and we know it was funded. The logic is not entirely insane, not entirely. Cats move freely through urban environments. In Washington, D.C., a city dense with embassies and parks and open diplomatic spaces, a stray cat is invisible. It is background. A Soviet intelligence officer trained in counter-surveillance, who clocks a man sitting too close on a nearby bench, who notices an unfamiliar face at a building window, that same officer would never look twice at a cat. Dogs draw attention. People wonder where a dog came from, whether someone is holding a leash they can't see. Cats attract nothing. They just exist, in a way that requires no explanation. And the CIA understood something about feline behavior that made the idea feel almost elegant in theory. Cats are drawn to human voices. They drift toward warmth and movement and conversation. They sit close to people. A properly conditioned cat would naturally position herself near exactly the kind of exchange a human agent would have to work to get close to. She would do it without appearing to try, without anyone thinking twice. The project was approved, given a classification, given a budget, given a name, Project Acoustic Kitty. What followed was 5 years of work that sits somewhere between visionary and grotesque, depending on how you read it. The engineering problem was genuine and difficult. In 1961, miniaturization was in its infancy. The computers of that era filled entire rooms. A radio transmitter with any practical power was the size of a shoebox, if not larger. Getting a transmitter, a microphone, a power source, and an antenna into the body of a living cat, without killing her, without visibly altering her behavior, without leaving anything a Soviet sweep team or even a casual observer might notice. That was not a trivial challenge. The CIA brought in audio equipment specialists, people who designed surveillance hardware for buildings and vehicles. They were given the assignment without being told what it was for. Standard protocol. Build something small enough to implant in a living system. Make it work at body temperature. Make it survive movement and moisture and biological unpredictability. They failed. Redesigned. Failed again. Iterated for years. The final configuration: a 3/4-inch radio transmitter surgically implanted at the base of the cat's skull, a microphone threaded into her ear canal, a battery placed in her chest cavity, a thin wire running from the nape of her neck through her fur to the tip of her tail, functioning as an antenna. The surgery took approximately an hour, multiple procedures over the course of the program. The project required not just that the cat survive, but that she appear and behave completely normally, that she move, groom, eat, and navigate the world without any sign of what had been done to her. Because the moment anyone near a target noticed something odd about a cat that was a little too interested in the wrong conversation, the operation was over. Victor Marchetti, a former CIA officer who served as special assistant to the Director of Central Intelligence, later chose his words carefully when he described what he saw. They slit the cat open, put batteries in him, wired him up. The tail was used as an antenna. They made a monstrosity. Marchetti said him. The cat's sex was apparently not a priority in the debrief, not a prototype, not an asset, a monstrosity. Marchetti was not a sentimental man. He had spent his career inside classified operations. That word, from him in that context, carries genuine weight. Now here's the second problem. More fundamental than the engineering, more foreseeable. more obvious to anyone who had spent even a few days around a cat. Cats do not do what you want them to do. This is not a character flaw. It is the essential nature of the species. Dogs have been shaped by tens of thousands of years of domestication to follow human direction, to want to please their handlers, to perform consistent tasks under pressure. Cats have not been shaped for any of that. They are solitary predators who have tolerated human proximity because it benefits them. They operate entirely on their own terms, governed by hunger, curiosity, and whatever catches their attention in a given moment. Robert Wallace, who later served as director of the CIA's Office of Technical Service, eventually summarized the problem with a candor that bordered on comedy. He said, "The cat wanted to do what the cat wanted to do, and not what we wanted it to do." That sentence contains years of operational frustration. The training sessions for Acoustic Kitty were, by every account, a systematic exercise in failure. The cat would be directed toward a target and become distracted by a passing bird. She would follow the conditioning through several steps and then simply sit down somewhere irrelevant because the light was better there. She would approach the intended area, veer off, and spend 20 minutes investigating a drain. The CIA tried hunger-based conditioning, adjusting her feeding schedule so the drive to find food would push her toward the people they wanted her to approach. This created a new problem. A hungry cat thinks about food. Every person carrying anything that smelled edible became more interesting than a Soviet diplomat. Hot dog carts were a crisis. Pigeons were a crisis. Lunch was a crisis. So the CIA went back to the operating room and surgically altered the cat's hunger drive. An additional procedure, additional recovery time, additional expense, because it turned out that hunger, a basic biological imperative, had not been adequately factored into the operational model for an animal spy. By 1966, after 5 years of surgery and conditioning and redesign, the decision was made. The cat was as ready as she was ever going to be. Time for a field test. The target, a location near the Soviet compound on Wisconsin Avenue in Washington, D.C. 2 Soviet officials had been spotted near a park bench outside the embassy grounds. They were having a conversation. The CIA didn't know what they were saying. That was the point. That was always the point. The van positioned itself across the street. Receivers calibrated. Officers put their headphones on. Years of classified work converged on this one moment. The van door opened. The cat stepped out onto Wisconsin Avenue. She walked into the road, and a taxi hit her. That is Marchetti's account, given to the Daily Telegraph in 2001 when the documents were first declassified. His words were simple. They put him out of the van, and a taxi comes and runs him over. There they were, sitting in the van with all those dials, and the cat was dead. CIA officers scrambled to retrieve the remains, not out of grief but out of operational necessity. They could not leave an animal on Wisconsin Avenue with a classified transmitter in her skull and a wire running through her fur. They collected what they could and drove back to Langley. Now, the other version. In 2013, Robert Wallace disputed the taxi story directly. He said the principal figure on the project told him the cat was not killed, that the CIA retrieved her safely, removed all the equipment in a second surgery, and that the cat was, in Wallace's words, re-sewn and went on to live a long and happy life. 2 credible sources. Contradictory accounts. No way from the outside to know which is true. But here is what I think is the most interesting thing about that dispute. More interesting than the question of which version is factually accurate. If the taxi story is a myth, it is a myth the CIA's own people created and then allowed to circulate for decades without correction. They did not issue a statement saying the cat was fine. They did not clarify the record when Marchetti gave his interview. They let the world believe their program ended with roadkill on Wisconsin Avenue, and they said nothing. Which means one of 2 things. Either they were too embarrassed by the program to engage with any version of it publicly, or they understood that the taxi story, even if not literally true, was accurate in every sense that matters. It captured perfectly the gap between the institutional ambition and the operational reality. It was the right ending for the story, regardless of what actually happened on Wisconsin Avenue. Sometimes a story is true in the way that counts most, not in its facts, but in what it reveals about the people and systems that produced it. In March 1967, after the field test, whatever form it actually took, a CIA officer sat down and wrote a memo. Its title was Views on Trained Cats, Classified, Filed. It sat in the archives for over 30 years until the National Security Archive at George Washington University obtained it through a Freedom of Information request. The memo described Project Acoustic Kitty as a remarkable scientific achievement. It stated that the work reflected great credit on the personnel who guided it. And then, in the same document, it concluded, while cats can indeed be trained to move short distances, the program would not lend itself in a practical sense to the intelligence problems at hand. Would not lend itself in a practical sense. That is bureaucratic language for, the cat walked into traffic on her first deployment and we are done. Or, if you prefer Wallace's version, the cat refused to do anything we needed her to do, and we are done. Either way, done. But I want to stay with that phrase, remarkable scientific achievement, because it is not entirely dishonest. The engineers who spent years compressing a radio transmitter to 3/4 of an inch were solving genuine problems. Those techniques fed into the broader miniaturization of electronics that continued through the following decades. The behavioral research accumulated real knowledge about the limits of feline trainability. The strategic logic be that animals moving naturally through an environment can access spaces no human agent or planted device can reach, turned out to be sound. It just needed better animals. The CIA's Raven programs, running in parallel, reportedly achieved operational capability. Ravens are highly intelligent, trainable in ways cats fundamentally are not, capable of precision placement of small objects on windowsills. Pigeons with miniature cameras flew over Soviet military installations and returned with photographs no human operative could have taken at comparable risk. Decades later, DARPA funded research into electronics implanted in the nervous systems of insects, actual insects, partially steerable through neural stimulation, able to navigate spaces nothing else could enter. The idea that Acoustic Kitty was supposed to validate did not die with the program. It evolved into vessels that could carry it. But none of that changes the central question this story raises. Not how did it end, but how did it last 5 years? The CIA in the 1960s was operating with minimal public oversight and essentially unlimited moral latitude when it came to countering the Soviet threat. MK-Ultra, the agency's program of LSD experiments and psychological manipulation on unwitting American citizens, which ran from 1953 through the mid-1960s, was active at the same time as Acoustic Kitty. The remote viewing program, in which the CIA paid and trained psychics to attempt to observe Soviet military installations through supernatural means, was funded in parallel. The exploding cigar and the poisoned seashell were seriously evaluated as methods of killing Fidel Castro. These were not rogue operations. They were funded, staffed, and institutionally sanctioned by people with the highest security clearances in the United States government. The people running them were not in most cases stupid. Many of them were brilliant. What they shared was not incompetence. It was the peculiar blindness that comes from operating in total secrecy, with unlimited resources, under genuine existential fear, and with no one authorized to look over their shoulder and ask the obvious question. When you believe the survival of civilization is at stake, the filter that normal organizations use to reject bad ideas stops working. An idea doesn't need to be good. It needs to be secret enough that no one outside the room can challenge it, and serious seeming enough that the people inside the room can keep telling themselves it might work. Project Acoustic Kitty passed both tests. Year after year it looked, from inside the classified architecture of the program, like a problem being solved, like progress being made, like something almost ready, until Wisconsin Avenue. I want to step away from the institutional analysis for a moment and just think about the cat. Not the program, not the technology, not the Cold War, just the animal, gray and white, female. We don't know her name, if she had one. We don't know where she came from or who chose her. She went through multiple surgeries. Her hunger drive was surgically altered. She spent months in conditioning sessions that made no sense to her, surrounded by humans focused on something she had no capacity to comprehend. She did not know about the Soviet Union. She had no concept of nuclear deterrence or intelligence operations or the fate of democratic civilization. She was hungry or she wasn't. Curious or she wasn't. She wanted to sit in the sun, or she didn't. She did what cats do. And then one day she was loaded into a van, driven through Washington, D.C. When the door opened onto Wisconsin Avenue, And either a taxi hit her, and that was the end of it, or the CIA carried her back, took the equipment out, and she went somewhere and lived the rest of her life in ordinary Katniss, with no memory of any of this and no idea what had been done to her or why. Either way, the CIA memo that followed mentioned her only in passing. The program's conclusion was framed around practical limitations and operational constraints. Whether anyone felt anything in particular about what had been done to this specific animal is not recorded anywhere in the documents that exist. History keeps what it decides to keep. When the files were declassified in 2001 and Marchetti told his story, the world laughed. It had to. The image was undeniably darkly funny. The most powerful intelligence service in the world, sitting in a van full of dials and receivers, watching a cab driver accidentally end 5 years of classified research. The laughter was appropriate. Sometimes that is the only honest response to a certain kind of institutional failure. But the laughter is also a way of not quite sitting with what the story actually says. Imagine you are one of those officers in the van on Wisconsin Avenue. You have worked on this for years. You have read every memo and sat in every briefing. You have watched the surgeries and the training failures and the redesigns. You have allowed yourself to believe, or have been required to believe, that this might actually work. That this strange and expensive and unprecedented idea might give American intelligence something no enemy in the world could anticipate or sweep for. You open the van door, you watch the cat walk out, you watch her move into the road, and then, taxi or no taxi, it is over. You know it is over the moment it happens, whichever version of events is true. You go back to Langley. You write the memo. You find language, remarkable scientific achievement, great credit on the personnel, that transforms years of institutional failure into something that can be filed and classified and sealed. Something that preserves everyone's dignity. Something that allows the door to close without breaking the handle. You call it a remarkable scientific achievement. And the cat stays on Wisconsin Avenue in 1966 forever, dead under a taxi or quietly carried back to the van. History can't quite decide which. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the ending was always the same regardless. A program that should never have started, closed by people who could never quite say that out loud, in language designed to mean everything except what it meant. The Cold War was not what the movies made it. It was stranger, darker, more human in the worst sense of that word, driven by real fear and real stakes and real people making decisions they believed were necessary, inside a system that had gradually lost the ability to distinguish between necessary and merely possible, between serious and correct, between classified and accountable. Project Acoustic Kitty is a footnote. But footnotes, read carefully, tell you more about history than the main text does. $20 million, 5 years. 1 field test, and a memo calling the whole thing a remarkable scientific achievement. That is what institutions do when no one is watching. That is what I am here to show you. If you made it to the end, thank you. Subscribe. Leave a comment. Which version do you believe? Did the taxi get her, or did she go home? And stay close because what you just heard is one of the more benign things buried in those archives. The Cold War was stranger than any fiction. We are just getting started.